We'll go ahead and get started. First, want to check in. How are you guys' papers coming? I'm just getting some nodding and some thumbs up, so that means none of you have questions. Everything's plugging away just nicely. Remind me, when is that paper due for you?
May 3rd.
You got some time, but also not a lot of time. So since you have until May 3rd, like that gives you plenty of time to maybe come ask me for questions or send me an email, or if you like have it done a week prior and you want me to take a look at a draft, you can. If you send it to me this Friday, it's going to take me until the evening to get to it because I'm in a training all day. Same with Saturday. But you can get it to me by then. I can get you feedback pretty quickly. It won't be the full-blown, I'm editing your entire paper for grammar kind of feedback, but it will be a, okay, you need to clarify this or you need to support this, that kind of stuff. How long does your paper have to be? Okay, Abby is, go ahead, Gavin.
I was just saying at least like 10 to 12 pages.
I believe Abby is hitting it on the nose, 12 to 15 pages of content, which means I don't care about your title page or your references. I'm only looking at your words, okay? To give you some idea of how big these things can be, my dissertation, the first half of it was 100 pages long. That's lit review and methods chapter, okay? I'm not asking you to put that much time and effort into it. I'm just saying you can fill out 12 to 15 pages with this type of material, okay? Something I would suggest, and something I very rarely see in papers, is focus on what's missing, okay? Like a lot of students do a great job summarizing what has been done, even going as far as to saying like, most of the studies have done this type of research. Very few students have actually done the, well, this is why this part of the research is important. Okay, this is what's missing. We need to look at this research question at this different angle, with this different sample, with this new methodology, with these different measures, so that you can address something that is off or weird, or address a gap in the literature. That makes sense? Like that takes a paper from like, okay, this is good, to yes, you nailed it, perfect, okay? To be quite honest, that's exactly what I look for every time when I read someone's lit review is, okay, you're telling me that you read stuff. Have you thought about it from the point of what needs to be done on this? With me? This is something where you might want to go back to your notes about the experimental design, measures, and sample, and look at, okay, well, they use these type of designs. What strengths and weaknesses do those have? Does that make sense? Okay. So, everyone good on that? When your guys' quizzes due?
Isn't it the week before finals?
I believe May 11th. Yeah, it is after the paper. I'm sorry the date has slipped my mind, but you have some additional time with that. Like, don't wait till the last minute to do them because that's just going to be really stressful for you. As far as the remainder of the course, this is the last set of lectures for the course. Next week is going to be presentations. This would be the opportunity to get your home office camera ready, I guess, because one of the things I'm going to ask you to do is turn your camera on so we can see your body language and how you talk. So next week's classes are going to be all in Zoom, which I guess only makes a difference for Abby since she's the only one who shows up in person. But I don't want you guys like being caught off guard by anything. All right. Everything making sense? Does anyone have any questions or concerns? Anything you want to talk about before we get started on qualitative research? All right, go ahead and get started then. Okay. So when we're looking at qualitative research, this is a type of research that is fairly different from the types of research you're probably most familiar with. Because when you look at something like a peer-reviewed article, 9 times out of 10, that article is going to be based in quantitative research, which means it has tried to quantify something using math, okay? But sometimes math really isn't the answer to a problem or to a question. So when we are trying to understand a lot of how and why types of questions, like how does someone make this decision? Why does someone behave in this certain way? That's a very difficult question to answer with something like a survey, and pretty much impossible to do something with like agency data or secondary data. So before we move on into the, I guess, the meat of the topic, can you think of any big examples of qualitative research that you're aware of? Anything coming to mind?
How many more seatbelt tickets are being written with like the click it or ticket laws?
Okay. So I believe that one was mentioned in your text, right? Do you remember how they did that?
No.
For the seatbelt laws, I may be wrong in this, but I believe they had trained observers at intersections, and the observer would look in people's windshields and see, okay, are you wearing a seatbelt correctly? Pretty easy thing to see because it's just a band over their shoulder, right shoulder or left shoulder, depending on if they're driver or passenger. So you just make a note, okay, that person's wearing it correctly, that person's not, next car, so on, so on, so on. Okay, why would that be a really hard thing to do with a survey? Okay, so we have that social desirability bias. So if you ask someone directly, do you do this thing that is like socially expected? They're going to say yes. Like you're going to have the obtuse individual who's going to say, no, I don't wear seatbelts because the government told me not or told me to. But all the people who just say, oh, they're uncomfortable or I don't believe they work or any of that other stuff, they're just going to lie. Okay. Why would agency data not really work with this? Why would using a police department's seatbelt citation data not work? How would you measure something from a police department related to seatbelts? What would be the things that you look at?
I mean, for police departments, really all you have is just the written citations that they have, not necessarily warnings or just not pulling somebody over because of it.
Right. So if you're trying to gather information on how prevalent seatbelt use is in a community, you're just going by the data that a police department has. All you're getting is, well, the police wrote a ticket in this situation. You're not getting, okay, did someone get really sneaky and like put it on before the cop showed up to the window? And we also know from like every other type of research that police cannot be everywhere and observe everything. So the only way to answer this question of how people's behavior has changed is to use field observations. Well, I guess technically we could look at things like accident reports, but if someone is choosing to not wear a seatbelt, they're probably also engaging in other risky behaviors. And also, there may not be enough of a sample size to really do anything with. So when we're looking at qualitative research, it's important to understand that this type of research is very, very useful in understanding decision-making and beliefs. Okay, there have been a lot of studies about how criminals, from gang members to youthful offenders to individuals who are in really disadvantaged areas, make decisions differently and why they believe that those decisions are justified. Okay. In a minute, we're going to talk about Elijah Anderson's Code of the Streets, which is what I think to be one of the seminal works in criminology. Like, everyone should read this. And if we had a community criminology class, I would make everyone read this. But also, we've had a lot of studies looking at how police officers make decisions. This could be from the Project on Policing Neighborhoods and study that was done in Indianapolis and St. Petersburg, Florida. I don't know why they picked those two cities, and I also don't know why there's a St. Petersburg in Florida. But in that study, they had grad students and undergraduate students do effectively ride-alongs for shifts. So have a student sitting there with a clipboard, and every single interaction that officer had with the community was coded out. Officer's demeanor, subject demeanor, bystander demeanor, number of bystanders, whether an officer used force, whether the suspect used force, like a bunch of different characteristics. Okay, this was definitely a much more quantitative study because it was set up to be that, but it incorporated a lot of qualitative elements because you had someone sitting in the vehicle with the officer for 8 to 12 hours at a time. But we also had some more, I guess, classical qualitative studies done on judges and district attorneys. How many of you have heard of the idea of the courtroom work group? Might be something from administration of justice systems or criminal law and procedure. That term familiar at all?
It sounds familiar, but I don't remember what it is.
This is a term that two researchers, Eisenstein and Jacobs, came up with to describe the relationship between a prosecutor, a defense attorney, and a judge. Basically saying that these three individuals, yes, they have different goals, they represent different interests, but they also have a lot of similar goals. Like Eisenstein and Jacobs went to courtrooms and just sat in on hearings. These are public events. You can go there. They just sat in a corner and watched how the defense attorneys were basically trying to smooth the process along, get their client the best deal possible in the shortest amount of time. Prosecutors were all about getting the easy win, so they were more likely to take a deal offered by a defense attorney. Like, my client pleads to this if you give this reduced sentence. Prosecutor chucks it off, they get a win for the day. Defense attorney gets to say, well, I got you this deal. You got to do a couple months in jail, but then you're out, rather than 2 to 3 years in prison. And the judge gets to keep things moving. Okay, it's not something you could really look at from official data like courtroom records or even a survey, because prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges are all lawyers, so they have lawyer ethics. They are very attuned to the fact that they are supposed to represent different interests. And if you call them out or ask them directly, hey, do you ever make a deal that is more about smoothing the process along rather than your client's best interest? All of them are going to say no. They're going to say, no, I'm always acting my client's best interest. But when you look at things from both the prosecutor and the defense attorney's perspectives, they also don't rock the boat. Okay? They don't do things that are out of the norm, and they try to keep things moving as quickly as possible. When we're looking at qualitative data, particularly when it's exploring how people make decisions, the biggest benefit is the fact that we can look at a subject's own words and just explore them, because people will often tell you exactly what they mean if you ask the question the right way. But also, qualitative research allows you to observe how people behave in the field, something you cannot get from official data or secondary data or surveys. Okay. An example of this would be Code of the Street. Now, this was a ethnography by Elijah Anderson. He was a sociologist, I believe, at Yale at the time. And what an ethnography means is it's a full-blown analysis of a particular topic. Okay. What Anderson basically did was he got an apartment in a really bad neighborhood in Philadelphia and lived there for 6 months. Okay, that's a level of immersion into a topic that most researchers cannot or will not ever do. Okay, what he found with this, after he was able to win people's trust and people stopped, reacting to him suspiciously, was that those disadvantaged neighborhoods have a nearly separate subculture and a different style of morality than the rest of Philadelphia. Okay. He basically found that individuals, when they're on the street, they will react in certain ways to protect themselves, even if they belong to the so-called decent culture, the culture that encourages hard work and going to school and obeying authorities and things like that. Even if someone in that neighborhood abides by the pro-social norms, they're still going to use the street code. They're still going to react aggressively if challenged in public. Okay? It's the idea of code switching. You might have heard about that from maybe juvenile justice, community corrections, criminology. But it's the idea that people are switching between the morality that they are falling under, depending on who they're interacting with and where. So someone who is walking to school, if they see a gang member or someone who is living under the street code, they may ditch their book bag. Okay, because they don't want to be seen as taking school seriously, because that may lead to increases in victimization. If they're challenged at school, they're going to fight, okay? Because in their minds, it's a lot better to take the suspension, take the record, than it is to be victimized. Because if you don't fight back, you're seen as weak and easy prey. So if you fight back, even if you lose, you still get and maintain respect. This makes sense? So I've got a video to show you. Pull it up real quick. So when we're looking at the effects of the code of the street on our understanding of what is going on in these neighborhoods, like I cannot really understate the idea that this changed the game when it came to community criminology, okay? And I don't know if this is completely accurate, but I do know that one of the few studies that actually tried to replicate Anderson's findings had to do so quantitatively. They sent surveys out. But they explicitly pulled measures and descriptions of thought processes and events from Anderson's book, from his interviews and observations. So asking people, how often do you change behavior based on who you're talking to in this neighborhood? How often do you engage in violent behavior as a means of survival? Okay. This is not the only example of qualitative research that we have. So some of the more classic examples would be Wright and Decker's Armed Robbers in Action. This came out in 1997, and it was basically Wright and Decker got a list of people who had been arrested for armed robbery in a particular city, got their home address, and went and talked to them, and then asked them to point them in the direction of other people who stuck people up and robbed them. Okay. This was one type of research where there's no possible way to do this probably ever again, because not very many IRBs are going to be willing to say, yes, you can absolutely go meet with someone who's been charged and convicted of armed robbery and ask them about past criminal behavior. You can absolutely do that. Okay. But this was also an extremely important piece, because up to this point, we had pretty much assumed that robberies were coincidental, okay, that there was no real planning involved. But Wright and Decker effectively showed there is a huge amount of planning. And it's not typically the planning done by like people who are planning a burglary or who are getting involved in the drug trade. It's the, okay, well, I need money to pay my electric bill, or I need money to fund my drug habit. So I'm gonna grab a gun and I'm gonna go to a place where I know people are coming out with money. So they, Wright and Decker interviewed several robbers who hung out around check cashing places, and in particular, around the first of the month, okay? Because that's when people's welfare and disability and unemployment checks would come in. So the victim would go cash the check, And then Wright and Decker would, or the robbers that Wright and Decker interviewed would ambush them about 2 blocks away. Okay. But in other instances, like these robbers were like, no, I'm targeting drug dealers. Like I only rob drug dealers. Okay. They have drugs, they have money, they don't have a gun, they're not going to call the cops. I'm robbing a drug dealer. Okay. So they showed that these individuals, even though I guess normal society would say that they are not rational individuals, were making extremely rational decisions. Okay. Same with Muir's book, Police, Street Corner Politicians. This was a book where in the 70s, Muir just went and observed a police department. It was fairly small. I don't actually know what specific department it was, but he identified 4 basic typologies of police officer behavior: the problem solver, the legalistic, the brutal, and the avoidant, and basically categorized each officer's behavior, their personality types, and how they would resolve different situations. And basically set up the idea that officers are not enforcing the law in the same way. Like it is dependent on their personality and their discretion. We've already discussed a little bit the project on policing neighborhoods, but some more recent examples that your book talks about are, we've had interviews done where we talk to police officers and ask them how they decide to use force and make arrests. We've done the same with probation officers and how they perceive both their work and their clients. This is really important because this would be a way that we could understand what makes a probation officer effective. If someone believes that, oh, I'm just cashing a paycheck and these people aren't going to reform their behavior, they're not going to be a successful probation officer because they're not putting the work in, they're just cashing a check. Same with things like attorneys' view of their client's compliance with them and their willingness to cooperate in their case, and how that influences what the attorney decides to do or what the attorney recommends. Okay. These are very deep and novel approaches to these types of problems. These are all very important things that we need to understand about the criminal justice system. In many instances, they rely on different types of qualitative research. Okay. The first type is the interview, all right? Pretty self-explanatory. This is a conversation between the interviewer and the respondent where the interviewer has a list of topics or specific questions that they'd like to cover during that session. These can be single session, like we're just meeting for an hour, we're going to talk about this thing and then you're never going to see me again, or it could be like multi-session meetings where the interviewer talks with their subject for a little while and then they come back at a later date and have follow-up questions or go a new direction based on other interviews. Okay. This allows the researcher to examine much more complex processes than surveys because you can ask follow-up questions. Like, yes, surveys can be very useful in getting responses in people's own words, but they require almost exclusively a written response. Actually, a lot of people aren't very good at communicating in written word. They're much better at verbalizing. So getting it in their own words, where the interviewer can also take into consideration their body language and their nonverbal communication, provides a lot more context to what's going on. Field research is also pretty self-explanatory. You go directly to the topic that you're interested in and observe it as completely as possible. In many instances, this is fairly hard. because, like, for one, at our university here in Hayes, we don't have a great amount of crime. And also, like, let's say we're interested in the crimes that do occur. What would you like the 5 of us to do? Should we go hang out at house parties and watch the underage drinking? Should we go hang out at Walmart and see if we can observe people shoplifting? Like, field research in and of itself is pretty difficult because it requires the topic of interest to be there and easy to predict where it's going to be. Okay, does this make sense? Everyone with me? So when we're looking at qualitative interviewing, this is all encompassing. Like, we're not really just concerned with a specific thing, like their responses to a particular stimuli or a situation. We want to get their perspectives. How do they view the situation? Their impressions, what situational characteristics stand out to them? Their past experiences in those situations. We want to understand what roles are important from like social roles. So is this person coming to challenge me, or is this person coming to talk to me? Is this person coming to sell me drugs, or are they a potential target for robbery? And we also need to explore their issues of identity. Do I identify as a gang member, a police officer, a defense attorney, a probation officer, a good student, whatever? There is no way, shape, or form that we could design a survey that would capture all of these things and not be 1,000 questions long, okay? But it's also important to understand that qualitative interviewing assumes that the beliefs and perspectives of both the interviewer and the subject affect not just the subject's behavior, but the responses that the interviewer gets. Okay. Elijah Anderson is a sociologist focusing on racial issues in America. He went into that neighborhood in Philadelphia to collect specific groups of information. Okay. It's not discounting his findings. That's not throwing shade on him as a researcher. That's just the reality of he has a specific subset of training and expertise, and that is going to affect what questions he asks. But that knowledge and that expertise allowed him to collect very, very detailed answers to those questions he was asking. Why do you behave a certain way? What beliefs about the criminal justice system or the wider society do you have? When is it okay to victimize someone? When is it okay to respond with violence? Okay. So much like survey questions, how the researcher designs or asks those questions is going to influence what types of responses they're going to get. So if someone doesn't have a high school education, you're going to change how you ask the questions. Okay. This is going to be kind of a weird question, but how many of you change how you talk based on who you're talking to? Okay, so Abby's raising her hand. So how do you change?
Like if I'm at work and I'm dealing with like a customer service issue, like I have more like a softer tone and
The customer service voice?
yeah, I have a customer service, especially on the phone.
What about the rest of you?
I'd say yeah.
Change how you talk, how you move.
Yeah.
How so, Gavin?
say when I'm like working, I have tried to use more authority because I'm a referee, and so I do that to help control how the games go.
So you're placed in a position of authority, so you have to adopt a particular persona. No one wants the referee to be a pushover. No one
Right.
wants the customer service rep to be mean, even when they deserve it. How about when you go to a different location, like a different city? Do you change how you move and how you act? I know I'm asking the question in the COVID times when we cannot travel. But
Yeah, I'd say so.
how so, Shelby?
I mean, when you go somewhere new, I mean, you watch people, so you kind of watch their behavior to know if you should do stuff that you do in your own hometown as to when you're traveling. I would say I watch the behavior before I change my behavior.
Can you give me an example? That's a really interesting thing you've hit on.
Trying to think of an example of the last time I traveled.
I know, really, really bad topic right now.
I guess here a couple of years ago, I went to Washington, D.C., and it's very, very fast paced there. Like, you always got to be going. I actually got stuck, or my purse got stuck in the elevator, or not the elevator, the subway, because I wasn't moving as fast as everybody else. And I'd say after that, I was right up with everybody. So I guess that could kind of be an example.
So you adapted your behavior so that you wouldn't seem out of place. Like, think about how the faculty at the university are dressed. Okay. All of us are wearing, probably business casual level clothes. Okay. For the most part. Like, few people walk around in suits all day, but we don't really talk about them. So how many of you have seen someone from camp, like who works at Fort Hays off campus and they're wearing something different? And it seems weird, doesn't it? Because you're not used to interacting with them in that environment. This is what I'm trying to get at with qualitative types of interviewing. Because you're actually in that subject's personal space and you're often in that subject's environment, you need to look not out of place. Not necessarily that you belong and that are from that environment, but you can't, if you're going to go interview a bunch of people in a disadvantaged neighborhood, you probably should not show up in a suit and tie. Okay. But if you're also going to go to a really ritzy area of Wichita or Kansas City, you also can't show up in board shorts and flip-flops. Okay. So depending on the subject and the topic, the researcher is going to have to adapt to what they're trying to accomplish. And they can do this through 3 different types of interviews. Okay. First, we have the structured, which is very similar to a survey. You have a list of questions and the researcher goes ahead, asks the questions, records your responses, okay? This is the most similar type of qualitative interview to a survey, but it also gets a lot more information. You're getting that respondent's own words, but you're also getting their body language, okay? Semi-structured is a lot more common because with this type of interview, you have that standardized list of questions, but if the researcher hears something that is worthy of a follow-up, they can ask, okay? So with Elijah Anderson, I believe he used the semi-structured type of interview initially, and then as he developed a rapport with these individuals in this community, he shifted to the unstructured type, which allows a much more open and more in-depth conversation, okay? Because when it comes down to it, a interview is a conversation. There's a purpose behind it. There is a goal, but it's also you're communicating with this person, not just giving them a list of questions and then walking away, okay? So when we're doing this in the field, the researcher has to meet with the subject and determine their level of interaction that they're going to have in the future. Okay. This could be a one-time thing where the researcher just gets that interview and moves on, or it could be over multiple sessions where you finish the time for the interview, you still have more topics you want to cover, or you want to re-listen to the interview to pull up points for follow-up, and then you can go and do that, right? This is also an opportunity for the researcher to employ the snowball sampling technique. So refresh my mind, what is that?
Like, isn't it the one where kind of word of mouth travels, like you sample one person and then they tell another one?
Basically, so Abby hit it on the head. You interview one person that you know has the characteristics that you want to focus on, okay? You ask that person, hey, do you know anyone who has these characteristics from this neighborhood, or has these certain views, or is a member of this group, or does this particular behavior? And you can basically get subjects that way. It's very effective, but it's also biased in the sense that you started with one person or 10 people. Who's to say that that 10 people was not biased to begin with, okay? When we're looking at meeting and interacting with participants, we also have to keep in mind the rapport, okay? Those of you who have like customer service jobs might be familiar with the idea of rapport. Basically, it is the amount that a researcher can connect with a subject to engender trust and make the conversation be a little bit more natural and get more information. Does that make sense? So, since all of you seem to be working at the moment, how do you get rapport with someone? What tactics do you use?
I know I like ask them questions about what they want or what they think they want, and just kind of feel out like what they're looking for or something like that.
Okay, so you ask questions that give them the opportunity to communicate what they want. What else?
I'll usually try to make a couple jokes or something before a game with the teams.
Okay, you put them at ease. You let them know that you're not going to like be the hard ass who's just going to put the hammer down on every kind of bad behavior or anything. You're not going to judge them. Introduce yourself, be polite, shake their hands in the non-COVID times. Now it's a wave or an elbow bump or something, you know, I guess a little bit more sanitary. What else do you do? How do you control your body language?
You know, look forward, smile, and like make eye contact.
Okay. Smile, you make eye contact, but also we have to keep in mind the cultural context. In those disadvantaged neighborhoods that Elijah Anderson was in, making eye contact with someone was seen as a threat. So a researcher coming in and not being aware of that particular fact might get punched in the face or worse. How many of you cross your arms? Like, I know it's one of those things that all business communication classes talk about. You never cross your arms when you're dealing with a customer because it makes you seem closed off. I don't know why. I'm assuming it's effective because everyone talks about it. But it's something that you're not really supposed to do because you want to keep yourself open and relaxed. You want to keep your hands visible, not in your pockets, not behind your back, but you also don't want to be wildly moving your hands, okay? All things that a researcher can do before they even open their mouth to connect with that subject, to seem like they're an approachable individual. Those of you who work in customer service are probably rolling your eyes because it's the same friggin' thing. Okay. Make sense? All right. So when we're trying to make sense of the data that we've gathered from interviews, we have a variety of ways in which to identify the different patterns of responses. So we have thinking units, which is basically you're looking at how people responded to questions in different ways. So going back to Wright and Decker, looking at how the robberers selected their targets, okay? So robber 1 said this, robber 2 said this, robber 3 said this, robber 4 said this, okay? These 4 things are in common, these 2 or 3 things are not in common. So why do all these people make decisions this way? Why do they decide things differently? With the sensitize and concept approach, this would be where we take their responses and interpret them based on existing theories or concepts. So Wright and Decker built a lot on routine activities theory. The idea that it's not so much the motivated offender that we can control, but it's the people who are the vulnerable target or who can act as guardians that we can bolster that will actually decrease victimization. Okay, so with Wright and Decker's approach, you can say, okay, well, this group of robbers who target people who are coming from check cashing places, they're vulnerable targets because they're leaving a place where you get money, and that seems to be the only service offered there. They target them on specific days so that it increases the likelihood that they're going to have a lot of money. And generally speaking, they're a low risk target. Someone who's picking up their disability insurance is probably not going to be putting up much of a fight. So from that standpoint, we can propose different things that would allow us to address those vulnerabilities. Increased lighting, putting police patrols around those areas, things of that nature. All right. Well, I guess we have last one, grounded theory approach. This is basically where you don't intend to disregard all the past research, but you're looking at what you've seen and what you've heard in this neighborhood or in this set of interviews, and you try to generate an explanation for all of those different responses, okay? So Code of the Streets did not really draw on community criminology very much, mainly because at the time, community criminology wasn't that big of a thing in criminology itself, just because we had moved into more classical deterrence and social interaction theories like social bond and social learning. So we did not focused a lot on how community level factors affected behavior. But also, he picked a neighborhood that was already disadvantaged. It already had all the characteristics that Sean McKay and other community theorists said that those bad neighborhoods were going to have. He went in and focused on the quote unquote black box, where we have these characteristics and then something happens and then crime is the third thing. Okay. He focused on that black box. Why do people commit crimes in this neighborhood? Everything making sense? All right. Does anyone have any questions? Comments, concerns, issues? All right. Is the snow still there? So it's very likely that we are going to get some high profile news in the next couple of days. If you have a moment, go make a snow angel or do something fun and ridiculous. By high profile news, I mean CNN's going to send out a news alert for something related to a verdict. So take some time. We can talk about all that trial stuff later if you'd like to, though I believe most of you are in my other classes, so probably going to get it from me there as well. All right. Is anyone, last call for questions? All right. I will see you guys on Thursday.